She had dreamed of becoming a mother all her life, but as the years went by, her hope faded. At the age of 72, she finally gave birth, thinking she had found happiness. But what her husband told her turned everything upside down. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The air inside the old house was thick with the scent of wood polish and aged fabric, the kind of smell that settled into the walls after decades of life. Bessie Harper sat in her worn armchair by the window, her fingers idly tracing the floral patterns of the cushion beneath her. Outside, the golden hues of the late afternoon sun spilled over the rooftops of their quiet southern neighborhood. The street was lined with large oak trees, their branches arching over the pavement like the arms of an old mother cradling her children. But there were no children here. Not in this house. She let out a slow sigh, watching as a group of children rode their bikes down the street, their laughter ringing through the air. A little girl with braided hair and scuffed sneakers wobbled slightly before regaining her balance. Bessie smiled faintly, remembering a time when she had imagined herself with a daughter just like that. But that was a lifetime ago. Behind her, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence. It had been a wedding gift from her father, a piece of furniture that had outlived nearly everything else in the house. The sound was comforting in a way, a steady presence in a life that had not gone as planned. Her husband, Lawrence, shuffled into the room, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. He was still a strong man despite his years, his posture straight, his broad shoulders still holding the weight of a lifetime. His hair, once thick and black, had turned silver, and deep lines carved stories into his dark skin. "You been sitting there all day?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble that carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime fixing things with his hands. Bessie smiled slightly. "Just thinking." Lawrence eased himself into the chair across from her with a grunt. "Thinking about what?" She hesitated. "The past." Lawrence sighed, rubbing his palm over his knee. They both knew what she meant. The years they had spent trying, the nights spent praying, the days filled with doctor's appointments, tests, whispered conversations that always ended in disappointment. They had married in the summer of 1971. Bessie had been 23, full of hope and promise, her heart set on building a family with the man she loved. They had spent the first few years of their marriage planning for a future filled with laughter, with tiny feet running down the hallways, with bedtime stories and scraped knees. But the years passed, and no children came. At first, they had brushed it off. "It'll happen when it's meant to," Lawrence had said, ever the optimist. But then 5 years turned into 10. They had visited doctors, specialists who ran test after test, who scribbled notes in charts and spoke in clinical terms that stripped the situation of its emotion. Bessie had suffered through hormone treatments, injections, diet changes, prayer circles at church. Nothing worked. The first miscarriage had been the hardest. Bessie had never told anyone how it had felt, the way her body had betrayed her, the way she had felt like something inside her had died along with the tiny life she had never gotten to meet. Lawrence had held her while she cried, whispering that they would try again. But the second time had been no different. And the third had nearly broken her. By the time she had reached her late 40s, the doctors had delivered the final blow. Blocked fallopian tubes, early menopause, a body that had simply refused to do what was expected of it. For a long time, Bessie had felt like less of a woman because of it. She had watched as other women in their church had babies, had watched them cradle their newborns, had attended christenings, had smiled and congratulated new mothers, while something inside her ached so fiercely that it made her feel hollow. And then, as the years stretched on, people had stopped asking. At first, there had been sympathy, encouragement. Then the questions had faded, replaced by quiet understanding. And, for some, quiet judgment. Because here in the Deep South, family was everything. A woman was expected to have children, to nurture, to build a legacy, and Bessie had failed. She had seen the looks from the older church women, the way they would purse their lips and shake their heads ever so slightly. No one had ever said it out loud, but she had heard the whispers. Poor Bessie. Never had a baby. She and Lawrence had learned to ignore it, to find fulfillment in each other, in the life they had built. They had traveled when they were younger, taken road trips, spent weekends fishing by the lake. They had nieces and nephews who visited on occasion, though the visits had grown less frequent over the years as those children had grown up, started families of their own. Now, in the quiet of their old house, with the weight of 70 years pressing down on her, Bessie wondered if it had all been enough. Lawrence cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. You ever regret it? She turned to look at him. Regret what? Not adopting. Bessie sighed. They had talked about it before, many times. There had been a moment, years ago, when they had considered it. But by then, they had already spent so much time mourning the family they had never had, the dream they had lost, that the idea of starting over with someone else's child had felt too painful. I don't know, she admitted. Lawrence nodded slowly. Me neither. The grandfather clock chimed, filling the silence between them. Outside, the children on the street had disappeared, their laughter fading into the evening air. Bessie watched as the sky darkened, streaks of orange and pink giving way to deep purple. Another day gone, another night ahead. She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting over her stomach, empty as it had always been. And she wondered, was this all there was? The evening air in their quiet southern town carried the scent of blooming magnolias, thick and sweet, mingling with the distant smoke of someone grilling ribs a few houses down. Bessie Harper sat on the couch, flipping through television channels with absent-minded boredom. Lawrence had long since retreated to his study, where he often spent his nights reading old newspapers or tinkering with the radio he had been trying to fix for the past decade. It was an ordinary night, one of thousands just like it. Until it wasn't. The news broadcast flickered onto the screen, and Bessie barely paid attention at first. But then a phrase caught her ear, pulling her out of her daze. 73-year-old woman gives birth to her first child after a successful IVF treatment. Her thumb froze over the remote. The image on the screen shifted to a woman, elderly, her skin lined with age, her hair thin and gray, yet her face glowing with a kind of joy that Bessie hadn't seen in years. She held a tiny baby in her arms, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket. Bessie's breath hitched in her throat. The reporter's voice continued, explaining how this woman, who had spent her entire life unable to conceive, had undergone in vitro fertilization and, against all odds, had carried a healthy baby to term. Bessie's heart pounded in her chest. The segment ended, cutting to another story, but the image of that woman, that baby, was burned into her mind. She sat there, unmoving, staring at the screen long after the news had moved on. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. Could it? Her hands trembled as she set the remote down on the coffee table. For decades, she had accepted her fate, convinced herself that it was over, that motherhood had passed her by. But now, for the first time in years, something stirred inside her. Hope. Bessie pushed herself up from the couch, her knees aching as she made her way down the hall. The house was dimly lit, the only light coming from the lamp in Lawrence's study. She paused in the doorway. Lawrence sat in his old recliner, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. A newspaper lay folded in his lap, and he glanced up at her, his brows raising slightly. "You all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "Did you see the news just now?" He shook his head, setting the paper aside. "What happened?" "There was a woman," Bessie started, stepping into the room, her voice unsteady. "A woman older than me. She had a baby." Lawrence blinked. "What?" 73 years old, she continued, her hands twisting together. "She went through IVF, and she had a baby." Lawrence exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. "IVF? At her age?" Bessie nodded. "And it worked." He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Bessie." She knew what he was going to say before he even said it. "I know it sounds crazy," she said quickly, stepping closer, "but what if it's not? What if I could?" Lawrence sighed, setting his glasses on the side table. "Bessie, honey, that's a long shot. A real long shot." "I know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I never even thought it was possible. And now—" She didn't finish the sentence. Lawrence leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest. He wasn't dismissing it outright, and that in itself was surprising. After all these years, after all the pain and disappointment, it should have been easy for him to say no, but he didn't. Instead, he watched her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You really want to go down that road?" he asked finally. She swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I think I want to find out." Lawrence didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at the floor, lost in thought. Then, after what felt like forever, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see what we can find." The next morning, Bessie wasted no time. She called the nearest fertility clinic, only to be met with polite but firm rejection. "Mrs. Harper, I'm afraid we don't conduct IVF for patients over 55. She tried another, and another. The responses were all the same. "We're sorry, but due to medical risks, there are no fertility treatments available for patients over 70. The chances of conception at this stage are—" She hung up the last call with a sinking feeling in her chest, but she wasn't giving up. She spent the rest of the day researching online, her laptop screen glowing with articles, studies, and medical reports. She found case after case of women in their 60s and 70s who had undergone IVF. Not many, but enough to give her hope. And then, finally, she found something. A name. A doctor. Dr. Raymond Scott, a fertility specialist based in Chicago. He had been in the news years ago for working with older women, pioneering controversial fertility treatments that had sparked debate in the medical world. Bessie sat back in her chair, her heart racing. This was it. She printed out the information, gripping the paper tightly in her hands. When Lawrence returned from running errands, she met him at the door, the paper clutched to her chest. "I found someone," she said, her voice breathless. Lawrence glanced at the paper, then at her. "Chicago?" She nodded. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is really what you want?" Bessie looked into his eyes, her voice steady. "I just want to know if we have a chance." Lawrence studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go find out." The morning light spilled through the lace curtains of the Harper home, casting golden streaks along the wooden floors. Bessie sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open in front of her, the name Dr. Raymond Scott glowing on the screen. The article she had printed the night before lay beside her, creased from how many times she had reread it. She traced her finger over the words, absorbing the details over and over again, as if by memorizing them she could make them real. Dr. Scott had been working with older patients for years, pushing the limits of fertility medicine. Some called him a pioneer, others a reckless opportunist. But that didn't matter to Bessie. What mattered was that he had made the impossible happen before. And maybe, just maybe, he could do it again. She took a deep breath and reached for the phone. The number of his clinic was printed at the bottom of the article. Her fingers hovered over the buttons before she pressed down, one digit at a time, until the call began to ring. Her heart pounded. A woman answered. "Dr. Scott's office. How may I assist you?" Bessie swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. "Hello, my name is Bessie Harper. I read about Dr. Scott and his work with older women and IVF. I'd like to schedule a consultation." There was a slight pause. Then, in a polite but measured tone, the receptionist asked, "May I ask how old you are, Mrs. Harper?" Bessie hesitated for just a second before answering. 72. Another pause, longer this time. "I see," the receptionist said finally. "I'll need to speak with Dr. Scott personally. Can I take your number and call you back?" Bessie gave her information and hung up, her hands trembling slightly. She exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm, but the nerves sat heavy in her chest. Lawrence entered the kitchen just as she set the phone down. He carried the faint scent of the outdoors, his hands rough from tending to the yard. He glanced at her, then at the phone, then back at her again. "You called," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "And they'll call back." Lawrence pulled out a chair across from her, lowering himself into it with a soft groan. His body was still strong, but the years had left their mark. He reached for the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup before speaking again. "You ready for this?" Bessie sighed. "I don't know, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what if." Lawrence studied her, his fingers tapping lightly against his cup. Then he nodded. "All right, then." They didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. They would wait. The call came the next morning. "Mrs. Harper?" The receptionist's voice was crisp, professional. "Dr. Scott has agreed to see you. He'd like to schedule an in-person consultation." Bessie felt her breath hitch. "Really?" "Yes. Can you come to Chicago next week?" She nearly dropped the phone in surprise. That soon. She quickly agreed, wrote down the details, and thanked the woman before hanging up. Then she turned to Lawrence, who was already watching her from across the room. "We're going to Chicago," she said. The train ride was long, stretching through miles of countryside before giving way to the towering skyline of the city. Bessie watched the landscape shift outside the window, her fingers gripping Lawrence's hand. He held hers tightly in return, his grip steady. Neither of them spoke much during the trip. The enormity of what they were doing weighed on them both. When they arrived in Chicago, the city hummed with life. The streets bustled with people moving at a pace far different from the slow rhythm of their town back home. Yellow taxis zipped past, car horns blared, and the sidewalks pulsed with energy. They found their hotel, a modest place not far from the clinic, and settled in for the night. Bessie lay awake long after Lawrence had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, they made their way to the clinic. The building was modern, sleek glass reflecting the gray sky above. Inside, the air was cool, the walls lined with soft pastel colors meant to be calming. Bessie checked in at the front desk, her voice barely above a whisper as she gave her name. The receptionist nodded, gesturing for them to take a seat. Minutes stretched into an eternity before they were called back. A nurse led them down a hallway, past closed doors where other patients sat, waiting for their own appointments. Finally, they entered a consultation room. Dr. Raymond Scott entered not long after. He was a tall man in his early 50s with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and sharp, analytical eyes. He greeted them both with a firm handshake before settling into his chair, flipping open a folder on the desk. "So, Mrs. Harper," he said, scanning the documents in front of him. "You want to have a baby?" Bessie swallowed, suddenly aware of how surreal this moment was. She nodded. Dr. Scott leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk. "You do understand how unprecedented this is, the risks involved?" "I do," Bessie said, "but I also know that other women have done it." Dr. Scott studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's start with some tests. I need to evaluate your health before we can discuss anything further. If your body isn't strong enough to carry a child, we won't move forward." Bessie nodded. "That's fair." The next few hours were a blur of medical exams, blood work, ultrasounds, scans, more tests than Bessie had undergone in years. Lawrence remained by her side through it all, his presence a steady anchor. Finally, they were called back into Dr. Scott's office. He looked over her results, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, setting the papers down, "your overall health is better than I expected for your age. That's a good sign. But this won't be easy. IVF is difficult for women half your age. At 72, it's nearly impossible. That being said," he paused, looking directly at Bessie, "it's not entirely out of the question." A lump formed in Bessie's throat. "But," Dr. Scott continued, "before we even consider moving forward, I need to be sure you understand the risks. This could take multiple attempts. Each cycle is physically demanding. And pregnancy at your age comes with high chances of complications, preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, heart strain, and that's assuming you even conceive. The odds are low, extremely low." Bessie met his gaze, but not zero. A hint of a smile flickered across Dr. Scott's face. "No, not zero." Bessie inhaled deeply, feeling Lawrence's hand rest gently on her knee. "I want to try," she said. Dr. Scott nodded. "Then let's get started." As they left the clinic, stepping out into the cool Chicago air, Bessie felt something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she was stepping into the unknown not with fear, but with hope. The morning after their first consultation with Dr. Scott, Bessie woke to the soft hum of Chicago just outside the window of their hotel room. The city sounded different from home, busier, more restless, filled with the energy of people constantly in motion. She lay in bed for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, absorbing the weight of the previous day. They had taken the first real step. There was no turning back now. Lawrence was already up, sitting at the small table in the corner of the room, flipping through a newspaper he had picked up from the hotel lobby. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, and beside him was a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He glanced up as she stirred. "Didn't think you'd ever wake up," he said. Bessie pushed herself upright, stretching her arms. "I was thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, rubbing her hands together. "Everything." Lawrence folded the newspaper and set it aside. "You sure you still want to do this?" The question wasn't accusatory, nor was it doubtful. It was steady, as he had always been, but it carried a weight that Bessie had come to recognize as his way of telling her that he wanted an honest answer, not just the one she thought he wanted to hear. She thought about all the reasons why she shouldn't do this. The risks, the exhaustion, the slim odds of success. But none of it changed the way her heart had felt when Dr. Scott had said it wasn't impossible. "I'm sure," she said softly. Lawrence exhaled, nodding. "Then we'd best get ready. Our first appointment's in an hour." The first few days of treatment were filled with tests, more than Bessie had expected. Blood work, ultrasounds, hormone level checks, screenings for conditions she had never even heard of. Dr. Scott was thorough, methodical, and he made no promises. By the end of the week, he sat across from them in his office, a stack of papers before him. His expression was unreadable as he scanned through her results. "Well," he said, tapping the top sheet with his pen, "the good news is you're in better health than most women your age. Your blood pressure is manageable, no signs of heart disease, and your body responded well to the preliminary hormone tests." Bessie allowed herself a small breath of relief. "But," Dr. Scott continued, "that doesn't mean this will be easy. Your body hasn't ovulated in decades, which means we're going to have to do everything artificially. You'll be on strong hormone treatments to stimulate your ovaries, and that in itself carries risks. You'll likely experience fatigue, headaches, mood swings, potentially worse. And even if we do manage to retrieve viable eggs, the chances of successful implantation are still very low." Bessie nodded. She had expected all of this. "And if we don't retrieve viable eggs?" she asked. Dr. Scott hesitated before answering. "Then we'll have to consider an egg donor." The thought made her stomach twist. She had always imagined carrying a child of her own, not someone else's. But she wasn't going to make that decision now, one step at a time. "When do we start?" Dr. Scott leaned back, watching her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We can begin hormone treatments immediately." The first injection felt surreal. A nurse showed her how to administer it, explaining the dosage, the timing, the side effects she should expect. The needle was small, barely a prick against her skin, but the weight of what it meant was enormous. She would have to do this every day, sometimes multiple times a day for weeks. The first few days were easy. The side effects were mild, only a slight headache, a little fatigue. But by the end of the first week, they hit her like a wave. The nausea came first. It lingered in her stomach from the moment she woke up, making food unappealing, even when she knew she needed to eat. Then came the exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that made even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. Lawrence took care of her as best he could, making sure she rested, reminding her to take her injections on schedule. But the hardest part wasn't the physical symptoms. It was the waiting. She had never been good at waiting. Each appointment brought more tests, more measurements, more evaluations. Dr. Scott watched her progress closely, adjusting her medication as needed. There were days when her body responded well, when he would nod approvingly at her results. And then there were days when the numbers weren't what they had hoped for, and Bessie felt the weight of failure pressing down on her. The first round of hormone treatments lasted 3 weeks. At the end of it, she and Lawrence sat in Dr. Scott's office, waiting for the verdict. "The results are mixed," he admitted, flipping through the charts. "Your body has responded, but not as strongly as we'd like. We've been able to stimulate some follicle growth, but I can't guarantee the eggs will be viable." Bessie swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Lawrence asked. "It means we proceed with retrieval and see what we get," Dr. Scott said. "But I need you to prepare for the possibility that we won't retrieve anything we can use." Bessie nodded. She had known this was a possibility. The procedure was scheduled for the next morning. She barely slept that night. Lawrence held her hand as they walked into the clinic, his grip firm, his presence grounding her. The procedure itself was simple. Dr. Scott used a thin needle to retrieve the eggs while she was under mild sedation. When she woke up, the first thing she saw was Lawrence sitting beside her, his face unreadable. She knew before he even spoke. "They couldn't retrieve anything," he said gently. Bessie closed her eyes. She had prepared herself for this, or at least she had thought she had. But hearing the words still hit her like a blow to the chest. Dr. Scott came in a few minutes later, his expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "We did everything we could, but your body simply doesn't produce viable eggs anymore." Bessie nodded slowly, swallowing back the lump in her throat. "There's still an option," he continued. "Egg donation. We can implant a fertilized embryo using a donor egg and Lawrence's sperm. It won't be genetically yours, but you would still carry the pregnancy, still experience everything that comes with it." The idea felt foreign, strange, but was it worse than giving up entirely? Dr. Scott gave them time to think, sending them home to rest. That night, Bessie sat on a hotel bed, staring out at the city skyline. Lawrence sat beside her, silent, waiting. Finally, she turned to him. "Do you think it would feel the same?" she asked. Lawrence reached out, taking her hand. "I think," he said slowly, "that if you want this, then it doesn't matter where the egg came from. That baby would still be ours." Bessie exhaled, pressing her fingers to her eyes. After a long moment, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "All right," Lawrence echoed. And just like that, they decided to try again. The decision to use a donor egg settled in Bessie's mind like a stone in deep water. It was there, solid and immovable, but it took time to accept the ripples it caused in her heart. She had always imagined a child of her own, one carrying her features, her mother's eyes, her father's strong chin. But now, she had to let go of that dream. This child, if there was to be one, would not carry her blood. But would it matter? Would it feel any different once that tiny life was growing inside her, once she felt it move, once she held it in her arms? Lawrence, steady as ever, held no hesitation. To him, this was simple. They would be parents, and that was all that mattered. He watched her carefully in those days after their decision, never pushing, never asking more than she was ready to say. But she could feel his hope. It radiated from him like quiet warmth, settling into the spaces between them. Dr. Scott wasted no time. A donor was selected. Young, healthy, with a medical history that showed no complications. They never saw her face, never knew her name. She was a stranger whose kindness would give them a chance at something they had long thought impossible. The fertilization process took time. The doctors worked with precision, creating embryos from the donor's eggs and Lawrence's contribution. Days passed in a haze of anticipation, and then, finally, the moment came. Dr. Scott sat across from them, a folder open before him. "We have 3 viable embryos," he said. "That's a good number, considering everything." Bessie clasped her hands together. 3 chances. That was more than she had dared to hope for. "We'll implant one," Dr. Scott continued, "and we'll freeze the others, just in case." Bessie nodded. It all felt surreal. This was happening. It was real. The embryo transfer was a quiet, delicate procedure. There was no pain, only a sense of something shifting, something beginning. And then, all they could do was wait. The 2 weeks between implantation and the pregnancy test stretched endlessly. Every moment was thick with hope and fear, with silent prayers whispered in the dark. Bessie tried not to let herself dream too much, but it was impossible. She found herself resting a hand over her stomach, as if she could will the tiny life inside her to stay, to grow, to become real. The morning of the test, she woke before dawn. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. Lawrence stirred beside her, then sat up slowly. He didn't ask if she was ready. He just took her hand and squeezed. The clinic was quiet when they arrived. Dr. Scott greeted them with his usual calm professionalism, but Bessie could see the hint of something softer in his expression. He knew what this meant to them. The blood test was quick, and then came the longest wait of all. Minutes crawled by, stretching into what felt like an eternity. And then, finally, Dr. Scott returned, holding a single sheet of paper. Bessie couldn't breathe. He looked at them both, then smiled. "Congratulations. You're pregnant." The world blurred. She felt Lawrence's hand tighten around hers, felt the rush of emotions so strong it nearly knocked her over. She was pregnant. After all these years, after all the heartbreak, after believing it would never happen, she was pregnant. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Every day brought a new wave of disbelief, of joy tempered with fear. She counted the days, each one a victory, each one a step closer to something she had thought was lost forever. The doctors watched her carefully. At her age, every moment of pregnancy carried risks. She followed every instruction, took every precaution. She moved slowly, listened to her body, rested as much as she could. The first ultrasound came at 8 weeks. She lay on the examination table, Lawrence's hand in hers as the technician moved the wand across her stomach. And then, there it was, a flickering light on the screen, a heartbeat, strong, steady. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Lawrence didn't speak, but she felt the tremor in his hand, the quiet emotion he rarely let show. At 12 weeks, they told their family. Some were overjoyed, others hesitant. There were murmurs of concern, of doubt. At your age, is it safe? What if something happens? Bessie understood their fears. She felt them herself. Every day was a battle between hope and worry. She knew the statistics, knew the risks, but she also knew that she had come too far to turn back now. The second trimester brought a strange sense of normalcy. The nausea faded, replaced by an ever-growing sense of wonder. Her belly swelled, her body changed in ways she had never thought she would experience. She felt the first flutter of movement at 16 weeks, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. By 20 weeks, it was undeniable. Lawrence would sit beside her at night, his hand resting gently over her stomach, waiting for the baby to move. Every kick, every stretch, every shift was a miracle. The media caught wind of her story. Reporters called, wanting interviews, wanting to turn her into a spectacle. Bessie refused. This wasn't for them. This was hers and Lawrence's, and the tiny life growing inside her. The closer she got to her due date, the harder it became. Her body ached in ways she hadn't expected. Simple tasks became difficult. But through it all, she held on. At 36 weeks, complications arose. Her blood pressure spiked. The doctors monitored her closely, concern etched into their faces. She was admitted to the hospital for observation. 37 weeks. The doctors didn't want to wait any longer. It was time. The delivery room was bright, sterile, filled with the hum of machines and the quiet murmurs of the medical team. Lawrence was by her side, his fingers wrapped tightly around hers. She had prepared herself for the pain, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the moment it happened. A cry. A sharp, piercing wail that filled the room. Her baby. Her daughter. The nurse placed the tiny, wriggling body against her chest, and Bessie felt the world shift around her. Tears blurred her vision as she looked down at the face she had waited a lifetime to see. She was small, delicate, perfect. Lawrence leaned over, pressing a trembling kiss to Bessie's forehead before looking at their daughter. His voice was rough when he spoke. "She's beautiful." Bessie let out a breathless laugh, her heart bursting with more love than she had ever thought possible. They had done it. Against every odd, against every doubt, every fear, she was here, their daughter, their hope. The first thing Bessie noticed was the weight of her daughter against her chest. Small, warm, fragile. The air in the delivery room felt thick, humming with exhaustion and relief, the echoes of muffled voices blending with the steady beeping of machines. The pain was still there, a dull, throbbing reminder of what she had just endured. But it was distant now, secondary to the overwhelming rush of emotions flooding through her. She was a mother. After 72 years, after decades of believing this moment would never come, after all the heartbreak and loss and longing, she was a mother. Lawrence hovered beside her, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, something unspoken. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, his fingers brushing over the baby's tiny head. She was wrapped in a hospital blanket, her skin still flushed, her eyes squeezed shut as she let out another small, protesting cry. Bessie tightened her arms around her daughter, pressing her cheek against the soft crown of her head. She inhaled, breathing in the faint, indescribable scent of newborn skin. It was real. This was real. "She's perfect," Lawrence murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Bessie looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she saw tears in his eyes. He blinked them away quickly, but she knew they were there. She knew what this meant to him, to both of them. A nurse approached gently. "We need to check her vitals now, Mrs. Harper." Bessie hesitated for just a moment before nodding, reluctantly loosening her hold. The nurse lifted the baby from her arms with practiced ease, carrying her over to a nearby table where the pediatric team had already begun their assessments. The absence was immediate. Bessie felt it in her bones, as if a part of her had been physically removed. She wanted to protest, to reach out, but she forced herself to stay still, her hands gripping the hospital sheets instead. Lawrence sat beside her, one of his large, calloused hands covering hers. "She's okay," he murmured, though his eyes never left the baby. "She's strong." Minutes stretched into an eternity as the nurses worked, checking every detail, measuring, weighing, listening to her heartbeat. "She's small," one of them said, "but everything looks good." Bessie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The doctor nodded approvingly before turning back to them. "She's perfectly healthy, a bit underweight, but that's expected given the circumstances. We'll keep an eye on her, but I don't see any major concerns." Relief flooded through Bessie's body so intensely that she felt lightheaded. Lawrence let out a quiet sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. The nurse returned, placing the baby back into Bessie's arms. She felt the world settle again, her heart beating in time with the tiny, fragile life nestled against her. Lawrence reached over, his fingers brushing over the baby's impossibly small hand. "Hope?" he said softly. Bessie glanced at him. "We should name her Hope," he said, his voice steady. "That's what she is, isn't she?" Bessie looked down at her daughter, at the tiny face relaxed in sleep, at the little fingers curled against her chest. Hope? Yes, that was exactly what she was. She nodded. Hope. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital routines, checkups, feeding schedules, whispered conversations between nurses and doctors. Bessie remained under close observation, her age making her recovery more complicated than most new mothers. She was exhausted, her body aching in ways she had never known possible, but she refused to rest unless hope was near. Lawrence barely left her side, hovering between her bed and the bassinet where their daughter slept. He spoke in quiet, reverent tones, as if afraid too much noise might break the fragile spell they had been placed under. But not everyone shared their awe. The news of her pregnancy had already sparked quiet controversy, but now that the baby was here, the attention grew louder. Reporters called, some even showing up at the hospital, hoping to capture a picture, a statement, a story. The whispers followed them in the hallways, nurses murmuring about the elderly mother in room 214, visitors glancing curiously as they passed by. And then there were the opinions. "It's irresponsible," one of the nurses said when she thought Bessie couldn't hear. "She won't even be around to see the baby grow up. She's going to be raising a child when she should be in a retirement home," another voice had muttered. Bessie pretended not to listen, but the words stayed with her, creeping into the corners of her thoughts when the nights stretched long and quiet. She knew what people thought. She had known before she even started this journey. She was too old, too fragile, selfish, foolish. She closed her eyes and held hope closer. The day they were discharged from the hospital, the sun shone bright in the crisp Chicago sky. Lawrence carried the car seat as they walked slowly to the exit, Bessie leaning into him for support. Hope was bundled tightly in a soft pink blanket, her tiny face barely visible beneath the fabric. As they stepped outside, a small group of reporters stood waiting, cameras poised, microphones in hand. Lawrence stiffened beside her. Bessie hesitated, then lifted her chin. She wasn't ashamed of what they had done. She wasn't ashamed of her daughter. Ignoring the barrage of questions, she walked past them, one hand resting protectively over the car seat. Lawrence followed, shielding them both as they reached the taxi waiting at the curb. The ride home was quiet, the city passing by in a blur of movement and noise. Bessie leaned her head back against the seat, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. Lawrence reached for her hand, his fingers strong and warm around hers. She looked down at Hope, who slept peacefully, unaware of the world she had just entered. A new life, a new beginning. She had never felt so terrified, or so blessed. When they finally arrived home, the house felt different, warmer, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Lawrence carried Hope inside, carefully setting her down in the crib they had prepared in their bedroom. Bessie stood beside him, watching their daughter sleep, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. This was real. They were parents. She reached for Lawrence's hand, gripping it tightly. "Welcome home, Hope," she whispered. The house was quieter than Bessie had ever remembered. It was a different kind of quiet, not the lonely stillness she had grown used to over the years, but a fragile, expectant hush that settled around them like a soft veil. Hope's tiny breaths, the occasional whimper in her sleep, the rustling of the blankets as she shifted, these were the new sounds that filled their world. Bessie sat in the rocking chair by the crib, her body aching from exhaustion, her mind thick with a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. She should have been resting. The doctors had warned her that recovery would be harder for someone her age, that she needed to take care of herself just as much as she took care of the baby. But how could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she woke at the slightest sound, convinced something was wrong. Lawrence moved quietly around the room, adjusting the baby monitor, checking the nightlight, straightening a blanket that didn't need straightening. He had always been the calm one, the steady presence she could lean on when the world felt too heavy. But lately, there was something different about him, something she couldn't quite place. He had been distant. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that others might notice, but Bessie knew him too well. She saw the way he lingered near the front window, how he hesitated before answering questions, how his mind seemed somewhere else even when he was holding their daughter. She didn't ask, not at first. There were too many other things demanding her attention, the endless cycle of feedings, diaper changes, doctor's visits. But the feeling stayed with her, pressing against the edges of her exhaustion like a persistent whisper. It wasn't until one afternoon, when she found him sitting alone in his study, staring at an old folder on his desk, that she finally spoke. "What's going on with you, Lawrence?" He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't heard her enter. His hand moved instinctively to cover the folder, but she had already seen it. A legal document. Old, worn, but still unmistakable. She stepped closer. "What is that?" Lawrence sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before pushing the folder toward her. "You might as well see for yourself." Bessie hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened the folder, scanning the first few lines, and the words hit her like a blow to the chest. Estate of Richard Harper. She looked up sharply. "Your father's will?" Lawrence nodded, his face unreadable. Confusion swirled in her mind. She had known about his father's estate, of course. Richard Harper had been a wealthy man, a businessman with properties and assets that had been passed down through the family. But Lawrence had never shown much interest in any of it. He had built his own life, worked his own jobs, made his own way in the world. What does this have to do with us? Lawrence exhaled slowly. There was a clause in the will. Something I never told you. Bessie's heart pounded as she read further, her breath catching at the next lines. Inheritance is to be granted only upon proof of a direct heir. Her gaze snapped back to Lawrence. This can't be real. It is, he said quietly. Bessie shook her head, trying to make sense of what she was reading. But that was decades ago. You've had this all this time? You never told me? I didn't think it mattered, Lawrence admitted. I never thought we'd have kids. I let it go. I made peace with it. He paused, his voice heavy. But when you saw that news story, when you wanted to try, I started thinking. Bessie's stomach twisted. So all of this, she gestured vaguely, her voice shaken. Was it about the money? No, Lawrence said immediately, his eyes locking onto hers. No, Bessie, don't do that. It was never about that. Not really. Not really? She repeated the words, a bitter taste in her mouth. Lawrence ran a hand over his head, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. At first, maybe it was a thought in the back of my mind, a possibility. But when you got pregnant, when I heard our baby's heartbeat, when I held her for the first time, none of that mattered anymore. I swear to you, Bessie, I would have done this with or without that will. Bessie wanted to believe him, but something inside her cracked at the realization that, at some point, even for a moment, their child's existence had been tied to something as cold and impersonal as money. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Lawrence hesitated. because I was afraid it would ruin this for you, for us. I didn't want you to think—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "I didn't want it to change anything." Bessie closed the folder slowly, pressing her hand against the cover as if trying to contain everything she was feeling. She had spent her entire life believing that hope was a gift, a miracle that had come to them after decades of waiting. And now there was a part of her that couldn't help but wonder, was she also a means to an end? She stood there for a long time, staring at the papers, at Lawrence, at the life they had built together. And she didn't know what to say. That night, she barely slept. Hope stirred in the crib beside her, her tiny breath soft and rhythmic. But Bessie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind running in circles. She wanted to believe Lawrence. She wanted to believe that none of this mattered, that their daughter's existence was still as pure and beautiful as she had thought it was. But the doubt lingered. The next morning, she didn't bring it up. She moved through the routine of feeding Hope, changing her, rocking her gently as the baby's small hands curled around her finger. Lawrence watched from across the room, silent, waiting. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "Are you going to claim it?" Lawrence hesitated before nodding. "I think we should." Bessie closed her eyes. It was impossible to deny what that money could do for them. They were old. They wouldn't be around forever. Hope would need security, a future. This money, this inheritance, could give her that, but at what cost? Bessie sighed, rocking Hope gently as she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. "I don't know if I can ever forget that this was part of it," she admitted. "But I do know that I love her more than anything in this world. And I know you do too." Lawrence reached out, resting his hand over hers. "That's all that matters, Bessie. That's all that's ever mattered." She wanted to believe him. She truly did. But as she sat there, holding their daughter, feeling the weight of both love and betrayal settle into her bones, she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. The days stretched into weeks, and though the house remained filled with the quiet rhythms of caring for a newborn, an unspoken weight lingered between Bessie and Lawrence. It was not anger, nor was it resentment. It was something quieter, more fragile, a thin wall of uncertainty, built brick by brick in the silence that followed their conversation about the inheritance. Bessie carried on as she always had, pouring every ounce of her love and attention into Hope. Each morning, she rose before the sun, cradling their daughter in the soft light of dawn, humming lullabies her mother had once sung to her. She marveled at the way Hope's fingers curled around her own, the way her tiny chest rose and fell with each breath. She traced the faint, wispy curls beginning to form atop her head, whispering promises of love and protection. But there was something inside Bessie that had shifted. It was impossible not to think about it. How, for a time, Lawrence had tied their daughter's existence to something as calculated as an inheritance. She wanted to believe him when he said it hadn't mattered, that hope was more than a means to a financial end. And in the quiet moments, when she saw the way he looked at their daughter, the way his face softened when he rocked her in his arms, she knew deep down that his love was real. And yet, the thought still clung to her like a shadow. She had spent her life believing that motherhood was something the world had denied her. That she and Lawrence had been destined to walk this life together, just the two of them, always loving but never growing beyond what they were. She had made peace with it, or at least she had convinced herself that she had. And then hope had come. A miracle. A gift. The proof that life was not yet done with her, that even in the later chapters of their story, New beginnings were still possible. But now, she questioned whether that miracle had been purely fate, or if it had been touched by something else, by the weight of desperation, by the lure of security, by a man who had, for just a moment, seen their child as a key to something greater than themselves. She wanted to let it go. She wanted to forget. But how could she? She did not speak of it again, and neither did Lawrence. Instead, they moved through the motions of new parenthood, adjusting to sleepless nights and early mornings, to diaper changes and doctor's visits, to the overwhelming, all-consuming love that came with raising a child. Hope was growing stronger each day. Though she had been born small, her cries became louder, her movements more purposeful. She had a way of watching them, her dark eyes wide and curious, as if she was already memorizing the world around her. One afternoon, as Bessie sat in the rocking chair with Hope nestled in her arms, Lawrence entered the room, a thick envelope in his hands. He hesitated before speaking. "I filed the claim," he said quietly. Bessie's chest tightened. She looked down at Hope, brushing a thumb over her tiny cheek before nodding. "All right." Lawrence sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Bessie, I need you to understand. This isn't about me. This is about her. About you." She met his gaze, searching for the sincerity in his words. "I don't want that money for myself," he continued. "I never did. But I'm not blind to what it can do. You and I, we're not young anymore. We won't always be here for her. If something happens to me tomorrow, I need to know that you'll have everything you need. And when the time comes, when neither of us is here, I need to know that Hope will be okay." Bessie swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I know," she whispered. Lawrence took a slow step forward, his voice softer now. "I don't regret any of this, Bessie, not a single moment, but I can't change how it started. All I can do is make sure it ends the right way." She looked down at their daughter again, feeling the steady warmth of her tiny body against her own. Hope stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft sigh before settling again. And in that moment, Bessie realized something. It didn't matter where it had started. It didn't matter that Lawrence had once seen a financial gain in their child's birth. It didn't matter that the idea had come to them not just through fate, but through something more calculated. It didn't matter how many doubts had crept into Bessie's heart. What mattered was here, right now. Hope was real. She was loved. She was theirs, and nothing, not a will, not an inheritance, not the opinions of the world, could change that. Bessie exhaled slowly, nodding at last. "We'll use it for her," she said, her voice steady now. "Nothing else." Lawrence smiled, a quiet relief washing over his features. "Nothing else," he agreed. The tension between them eased after that, slowly, gradually, like the lifting of a storm. They spoke of it no more, and instead they turned their focus to the days ahead. The seasons changed. The leaves turned golden and brittle, then fell to the earth. Winter crept in, blanketing the world in frost. Hope's first Christmas was spent wrapped in soft blankets, nestled in Bessie's arms as Lawrence lit a fire in the hearth. And then, spring. Hope's first laugh came on a quiet morning in April. It was unexpected, sudden, a burst of joy that filled the air like the sound of bells. Bessie and Lawrence froze, staring at each other in shock before breaking into laughter of their own. Bessie pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, feeling the warmth of the moment settle deep in her bones. She had spent so many years believing that this would never be her life. And yet, here she was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Bessie sat on the porch with Hope nestled against her chest. Lawrence stood beside them, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. She turned her head slightly, looking up at him. "Regret what?" "Not having her sooner." Bessie considered the question for a long moment before shaking her head. "No," she said simply, "because if we had, she wouldn't be her, and I wouldn't trade her for anything in this world." Lawrence smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. And as Bessie looked down at Hope, at the tiny life cradled in her arms, she knew with absolute certainty that no matter what had led them here, this was exactly where they were meant to be. Subscribe to the channel, or else you'll miss stories that challenge everything you thought was possible. Stay with us for more, and if this story moved you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear it today. And when you're ready for another journey, there's more waiting for you in the next video.